A heated school board meeting spirals out of control when a teacher publicly ridicules a poised black woman, completely unaware of her true identity. But when the shocking truth comes to light, how will the room and the teacher react? Let us know where you're watching from as we dive into this powerful story. Who even approved these policies in the first place? Kenneth McAllister's voice boomed across the crowded auditorium, his words dripping with irritation. His glare bounced around the room, landing on no one in particular but making everyone uncomfortable. This isn't what our school needs. We need discipline, not political agendas. The tension in the room thickened as murmurs of agreement and disapproval rippled through the audience. The school board meeting had started as a calm discussion on curriculum updates, but had quickly unraveled into a heated debate over the district's new equity and anti-racism initiatives. Samantha Brooks sat quietly in the back row, her face composed as she observed the chaos. She had arrived a few minutes after the meeting had started, deliberately avoiding the center seats to avoid drawing attention to herself. Dressed in a tailored blazer and sleek heels, she exuded confidence. But she didn't speak. Not yet. McAllister, a veteran teacher who had taught at the high school for over 20 years, was in full rant mode now. He jabbed a finger at the agenda on the projector screen, as if the mere sight of it offended him. These so-called anti-racism workshops are just another way to make teachers like me the bad guy, he declared. We're already overworked, underpaid, and now you want to tell us we're part of the problem? It's insulting. A few people clapped hesitantly, though most attendees exchanged uneasy glances. McAllister had a reputation for being outspoken, but tonight, his words felt particularly sharp. "To McAllister," interjected one of the school board members, a woman in her early 40s with a calm yet firm demeanor. These policies were approved unanimously by the board after months of discussion with educators and parents. They are designed to foster inclusivity and ensure all students feel seen and supported. "That's easy for you to say," McAllister shot back, his voice rising. "You sit in your air-conditioned offices making decisions that we have to implement. You don't know what it's like in the classroom, dealing with kids who don't even want to learn." Samantha's lips tightened, but she remained silent, her eyes steady on McAllister. His frustration was palpable, but it was clear he was crossing lines he didn't even realize existed. "That's not entirely true, Mr. McAllister," chimed in a soft voice from the second row. A young black mother, clutching a notebook in her lap, spoke up timidly. "These policies aren't about blaming anyone. They're about creating a better environment for all our kids. My son—" "Well, here we go," McAllister interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Another parent who thinks they know more about education than the professionals." He snorted, and a few uncomfortable chuckles echoed from his supporters. The woman's face flushed, and she shrank back into her seat. Several attendees turned to look at Samantha, sensing her growing frustration even though she hadn't said a word. Finally, Samantha leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the edge of her chair. Her movement was subtle, but it drew the attention of those seated near her. She wasn't planning to speak yet, but the tension in the room made it clear that her silence would soon end. "Let's keep this civil," the board chair said, attempting to regain control. "This is a space for open dialogue." But McAllister was on a roll. His eyes landed on Samantha, who was sitting near the back. "And you," he said loudly, pointing in her direction, "sitting there all quiet like you've got all the answers. If you've got something to say, let's hear it. Or are you just here to look important?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. Samantha raised an eyebrow, her expression unflinching. The silence that followed was deafening. The board chair's gavel came down sharply. "Mr. McAllister, that's enough," she said, her voice firm. But McAllister wasn't done. "No, I'm serious," he continued, his tone defiant. "Everyone's got something to say about how we should run our classrooms, but where's the accountability for these so-called experts? I've been teaching for 2 decades. I know what works and what doesn't." Samantha slowly stood, her movements deliberate. The chatter in the room ceased instantly, all eyes now focused on her. Even McAllister's bravado faltered as he took in her poised demeanor. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," Samantha began, her voice calm but resonant. but it seems I don't have much of a choice." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Samantha took a step forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor as she moved toward the front of the room. She was no longer just an observer. She was commanding the space. "I've been listening," she said, her eyes locking with McAllister's, "listening to your frustrations, your concerns, and your accusations. And while I understand that change can be difficult, I'm struggling to understand why you believe these initiatives are an attack on you personally." McAllister opened his mouth to respond, but Samantha held up a hand, silencing him. "You've had your turn," she said firmly. "Now it's mine." The crowd murmured in approval, and McAllister crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "I've spent the last several years working in education," Samantha continued. "I've sat in classrooms, I've reviewed curriculum, and I've worked with communities to ensure that our schools are not just places of learning, but places of belonging." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Because that's what this is about. Belonging. Every student deserves to walk into a classroom and see a reflection of themselves in their teachers, their curriculum, and their peers. And every teacher deserves to feel supported, not just by their colleagues, but by their community." The room was silent, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "And yet," she said, her tone hardening, "what I've witnessed tonight is a glaring example of the very problem we're trying to solve: dismissiveness, prejudice, and unwillingness to listen." McAllister shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't interrupt. Samantha turned to the board members. "These initiatives are not about placing blame. They're about creating a better future for everyone in this district. And if there's one thing I know, is that progress requires courage. Courage to challenge our biases, to step outside of our comfort zones, and to embrace change." Her words hung in the air for a moment before she turned back to McAllister. "And as for you," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I suggest you take a long, hard look at what you're fighting so hard to preserve. Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like progress." The audience erupted into applause, the sound reverberating off the walls. McAllister's face turned red, but he didn't say another word. As Samantha returned to her seat, several people leaned over to whisper words of encouragement, but her work was far from over. This was just the beginning. For now, though, she would let the moment speak for itself. Because sometimes silence carried more weight than words ever could. Kenneth McAllister sat rigid in his chair, his jaw tight and his eyes glued to the floor. The applause that had erupted after Samantha's speech had faded, but the tension lingered like an unwelcome guest in the room. The school board meeting wasn't over yet, but McAllister felt as though he had already lost something intangible, something he wasn't sure he could regain. Samantha Brooks, on the other hand, returned to her seat with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the weight of her words. She could feel the eyes on her, the unspoken curiosity buzzing in the room. People wanted to know who she was, what had given her the authority and composure to speak so decisively. The board chair cleared her throat and adjusted her glasses, trying to bring the meeting back on track. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks, for your perspective," she said, glancing briefly in Samantha's direction. "Before we move forward with tonight's agenda, are there any additional comments on the proposed policies?" A young teacher raised her hand hesitantly. "I'd just like to say that I support these initiatives," she began, her voice shaky but earnest. "As someone who's new to the district, I've already seen how some students feel left out or ignored in the classroom. I think these changes are necessary to make sure all kids feel like they belong." The room murmured again, this time with a mix of support and skepticism. McAllister scoffed under his breath, leaning back in his chair with a disapproving shake of his head. Samantha didn't miss the gesture, but she chose to stay silent. For now. Another parent stood up, a middle-aged man with salt-and-pepper hair and an air of authority. "I understand the good intentions behind these policies," he said, his tone measured. "But I worry about the resources. How are we going to afford all these changes? Hiring new staff, providing training, it all costs money. and our schools are already underfunded. This time, Samantha decided to respond. She rose from her seat once again, her movements deliberate. "May I address that concern?" she asked, her voice calm yet commanding. The board chair nodded. "The floor is yours, Miss Brooks." Samantha turned to the man who had spoken. "You're absolutely right. Resources are a valid concern," she began. "But the truth is we can't afford not to make these changes. The cost of inaction is far greater than the financial investment required to implement these policies." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "When students don't feel seen or valued, their academic performance suffers. They disengage, they drop out, and they miss opportunities to reach their full potential. That affects not just the students themselves, but the entire community. Investing in equity is an investment in our future." The man nodded slowly, his skepticism giving way to understanding. Samantha could see that her message was beginning to resonate, but not everyone in the room was so easily swayed. McAllister suddenly sat up straight, his frustration boiling over. "That's a nice speech," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But speeches don't pay the bills. You talk about investment. What about the teachers who are already stretched thin? Who's going to support us while we're forced to sit through these workshops and change our entire way of teaching?" Samantha turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "Mr. McAllister, I understand that change can feel overwhelming, but these workshops aren't about punishing teachers or making your job harder. They're about giving you the tools to connect with your students in a meaningful way." McAllister rolled his eyes. "And what if I don't want those tools? What if I think the way I've been teaching for 20 years is good enough?" A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Samantha took a step closer to McAllister, her gaze steady. "Then I would ask you to consider why you're so resistant to growth," she said, her voice even. "Education is about more than just textbooks and lesson plans. It's about preparing students to navigate a diverse and complex world. If we're not willing to adapt, how can we expect our students to thrive?" She pulled herself out of her anecdotal work experience. Her voice startled her. McAllister opened his mouth to retort, but the words didn't come. He looked away, his face flushing with a mix of anger and embarrassment. Samantha let the silence linger for a moment before turning back to the rest of the room. "I know this isn't easy," she said, addressing the audience, "but nothing worth doing ever is. This is a chance for us to be leaders, not just in academics, but in empathy, understanding, and community building. I believe we can rise to the occasion. The question is, do you?" The room erupted into applause once again, louder and more sustained than before. Even those who had been on the fence seemed moved by Samantha's words. McAllister, however, remained silent, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. As the applause died down, the board chair spoke up. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks. I think it's clear that we have much to consider as we move forward." She glanced at her notes, preparing to transition to the next agenda item, when one of the parents raised her hand. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice curious. "Mr. Brooks, you speak with so much passion and authority. Are you a teacher or a member of the board?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Samantha. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "No, I'm not a teacher," she said, "and I'm not a board member, at least not yet." She paused, glancing around the room. "I'm Samantha Brooks, and I'm honored to be your new superintendent." The reaction was immediate. Gasps of surprise echoed through the auditorium, followed by a wave of murmured conversations. McAllister's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, he looked as though he had been struck by lightning. Samantha let the revelation settle before continuing. "I didn't come here tonight to make a grand entrance," she said. "I came to listen, to learn, and to understand the challenges our district is facing. But after hearing some of the comments tonight, I realized that I couldn't stay silent." She turned to McAllister, her expression softening just slightly. "I'm not here to make enemies, Mr. McAllister. I'm here to build bridges, to create an environment where teachers, students, and families can all succeed together. I hope you'll join me in that effort." McAllister stared at her, his face a mix of emotions. Anger, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite name. He didn't respond, but Samantha didn't press him. She had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to him to decide how he would move forward. The board chair, clearly trying to regain control of the meeting, cleared her throat. "Thank you for introducing yourself, Superintendent Brooks," she said, her tone respectful. "We look forward to working with you." The meeting continued, but the energy in the room had shifted. People whispered excitedly about the new superintendent, while others exchanged thoughtful glances, clearly re-evaluating their positions on the issues at hand. As Samantha returned to her seat, she felt a sense of accomplishment, tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. Tonight had been just the beginning. The real work, the hard work, was still to come. But as she looked around the room, at the faces of parents, teachers, and board members, she felt a glimmer of hope. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it, and Samantha Brooks was ready to lead the charge. The school board meeting adjourned with the sound of chairs scraping against the floor and murmured conversations filling the air. Samantha Brooks remained seated, letting the crowd dissipate around her. She had delivered her introduction, made her presence known, and planted seeds of change. Now, it was time to see what would grow. Kenneth McAllister lingered near the doorway, his face clouded with thought. The revelation that Samantha was the new superintendent had shaken him, though he tried to mask it. He watched her calmly gather her belongings, her every movement deliberate and composed. She didn't appear rattled, despite the tension that had electrified the room moments ago. "You know, McAllister," a voice called. It was one of his colleagues, an older teacher with a graying beard and a cautious smile. "You heading out?" "In a minute," McAllister muttered, his eyes still on Samantha. He wasn't sure why he couldn't bring himself to leave, but something about the way she carried herself, unbothered yet determined, nagged at him. Samantha felt his gaze but didn't react. Instead, she slid her laptop into her bag and straightened her blazer. She knew this wouldn't be the last time McAllister tried to undermine her, but she also knew that she had left him with little ammunition for his next attack. For now, her silence spoke louder than any confrontation. As the room emptied, a young teacher approached Samantha hesitantly. "Miss Brooks?" she asked, clutching a notebook to her chest. Samantha looked up and offered a warm smile. "Yes? I just wanted to say thank you," the teacher said, her voice wavering slightly. "What you said tonight, it really meant a lot. Sometimes it feels like we're fighting a losing battle. But hearing you talk about belonging and progress, it gave me hope." Samantha reached out and gently squeezed the teacher's hand. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "Change is never easy, but it starts with people like you, people who care enough to push forward, even when it's hard." The teacher nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I'll do my best." "That's all I ask," Samantha said with a smile. As the teacher walked away, McAllister finally found the courage to approach. He cleared his throat awkwardly, and Samantha turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Superintendent Brooks," he began, the title feeling foreign on his tongue. "Do you have a moment?" She raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind, Mr. McAllister?" He hesitated, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. "Look, I know I came off strong earlier," he said, his tone stiff. "But I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen a lot of policies come and go, and most of them don't amount to much. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm skeptical." Samantha folded her arms, her gaze steady. "Skepticism is healthy, Mr. McAllister, but what I saw tonight went beyond skepticism. It was resistance to change, to growth, and to the very idea that we can do better." McAllister flinched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck and let out a heavy sigh. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. "I've been in this job so long, it's hard to see things any other way." Samantha softened slightly. "Change is uncomfortable," she said, "but it's also necessary. If we want to prepare our students for the world they're going to inherit, we have to start by challenging ourselves. That means unlearning some of the things we've taken for granted." McAllister nodded slowly, her words sinking in. "I'm not saying I agree with everything you're proposing," he said cautiously, "but I'm willing to give it a chance. For the kids." A small smile touched Samantha's lips. "That's all I can ask for, Mr. McAllister. Thank you." He nodded again, then turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he paused and looked back. "For what it's worth," he said, "you handled yourself well tonight. Better than I expected." Samantha chuckled softly. "Thank you, I think." As McAllister disappeared through the doorway, Samantha exhaled deeply. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start, and in her line of work, even small steps mattered. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, introductions, and planning sessions. Samantha dove headfirst into her new role, determined to build trust and momentum within the district. She visited schools, met with teachers, and held listening sessions with parents and students. Her approach was clear. She wanted to hear their stories, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. At first there was resistance, particularly from those who shared McAllister's skepticism. But Samantha's persistence and genuine commitment began to win people over. She didn't just talk about change, she demonstrated it, leading by example and showing that she was willing to put in the work. One afternoon, Samantha visited the high school where McAllister taught. She had scheduled a meeting with the faculty to discuss the upcoming workshops, and she knew it would be a challenging crowd. Many of the teachers were veterans like McAllister, and they were wary of what they saw as another top-down mandate. The meeting started predictably, with questions about time, resources, and the practicality of implementing the new policies. But as the discussion unfolded, something shifted. Teachers began to open up, sharing their own experiences and frustrations. One teacher spoke about a student who had struggled with racial bullying, while another admitted to feeling unprepared to handle discussions about diversity in the classroom. Samantha listened intently, validating their concerns while gently guiding the conversation towards solutions. "I'm not here to tell you how to do your jobs," she said. "I'm here to support you, to give you the tools you need to create the best possible environment for your students. This isn't about blame. It's about partnership." By the end of the meeting, even McAllister seemed less resistant. He didn't say much, but Samantha caught him nodding thoughtfully as one of his colleagues shared a story about a breakthrough she'd had with a struggling student. As the teachers filed out of the room, McAllister lingered behind once again. He approached Samantha, his expression unreadable. "You're good at this," he said grudgingly. "Talking to people, making them feel heard." Samantha smiled. "It's not about being good at it," she replied. "It's about caring enough to try." McAllister considered her words for a moment before nodding. "I guess we'll see how this all plays out." "We will," Samantha agreed, "and I hope you'll be part of it." Months later, the district began to see the first signs of change. Teachers who had initially resisted the workshops started sharing positive feedback, and students reported feeling more included and supported in their classrooms. The journey was far from over, but progress was being made, one step at a time. As for McAllister, he remained a work in progress. He still bristled at some of the changes, but his interactions with Samantha grew less combative and more constructive. Over time, he even began to implement some of the strategies he had once dismissed, finding that they made a difference in his classroom. One evening, as Samantha was leaving the district office, she found a handwritten note slipped under her door. It was from McAllister. It read simply, "Thank you for not giving up on us. I may not always agree with you, but I'm starting to see the bigger picture." Samantha smiled as she folded the note and tucked it into her bag. Change was never easy, but moments like this reminded her why she had chosen this path. She wasn't just fighting for policies. She was fighting for people, for progress, and for a future where every student could thrive. And that fight was far from over. But with each small victory, Samantha knew she was moving closer to the world she envisioned. A world where belonging wasn't just a goal, but a reality.